Do you actually realize that you're insane? Professor Bardsley paused, apparently caught off guard by this. A tense silence pierced the air for several moments before he finally spoke again. Yes, he conceded. And then he started to laugh. I never used to understand why I was so different from everyone else. It wasn't until I started studying psychology that I realized what it was. Sociopathy, defined as a lack of empathy or remorse. I remember the day I realized it, Professor Bardsley continued. Oh, how it scared me. If anyone else ever found out, I knew they would lock me away somewhere where I'd never see the light of day again. But I couldn't let that happen, oh no. So I educated myself. I learned how to fit in, so no one would notice. He gave a calm, eerie smile. I became a scholar even, so I was too valuable to be locked away. It worked so well, didn't it? No one suspected a thing. Not until Gunderson, at any rate. I could have gotten away with it if it weren't for that hyper-vigilant fool. But none of that matters anymore, does it? Professor Bardsley started to laugh again. It doesn't matter what anyone thinks of me, because there's nothing more they can do about it. The Mafia controls this town now. I can't be locked away or killed again because I'm just too powerful. I can do anything I want, and no one can stop me. Professor Bardsley wasn't bothered by many things. The townspeople's accusations didn't bother him. What good would it do them? Winter's wrath had already won. Throwing a fuss about it was a noble effort, but ultimately meaningless. Nothing they could say would change the situation or sway the cold-hearted hearts of the Mafia. The deluded gamer boy's attack didn't bother him. It was mildly irritating, perhaps, but ultimately an equally useless endeavor. In fact, it was really quite amusing watching the boy act as though he mattered. But he didn't matter. He was meaningless, just like all the others. Not even the crying child begging for Gunderson to live bothered him. The poor, ignorant boy, trying to stop the killing by sparing the life of the most violent killer in Ifem Cove. Professor Bardsley had to laugh. This boy was not going to change their minds. Mortimer Gunderson was destined to die. It was Mr. Endicott's statement that caught him off guard. Maybe someday you'll find an actual meaning to your life. What was that supposed to mean? An actual meaning? He could not be more satisfied with his life right now. So satisfied to be alive after having experienced death. Professor Leland G. Bardsley was among the best of his field. No, the best in his field. Perhaps other anthropologists let such useless things as morality and emotion cloud their research, but Leland Bardsley did not. He had watched the collapse of society. He had caused the collapse of society. He had the opportunity to make the best research any anthropologist could ever dream of, and he was a part of it. I'm sure you will pay him no attention. He is an inferior intellect, Dr. Pallada spoke, reaffirming his stance. They call us mad because they simply do not understand. He was a fool, but he will not bother you anymore, and history will judge who is right, and you are the one who is right. It is written by the winners, if you discount revisionism, which you should not, by the way. She shook her head. My point is, nobody will lock you away now. You are far too powerful and too magnificent. You have usurped the powers of this town and shifted the paradigms of this society to let your Mafia become the rulers of it. You have not killed the society, but you have redefined it, and I very much look forward to seeing what comes of it, as well as analyzing how you have come to be in this position. Professor Bardsley's scowl faded, replaced by his usual calm smile. Dr. Pallada was right. Mr. Endicott just didn't understand. Very few people did. Why should he let the words of the ignorant get to him? Professor Bardsley was above that. He wouldn't let a simple hairdresser bother him like that. And then Richam had to open his mouth. Hey, you must be Juan's girl. I've heard a ton about you, the idiot said. I tip my hat to you for taming that bad boy. He makes the best hummus. Professor Bardsley was baffled by this. What? Was he implying that he and Dr. Pallada were... No, of course he was. This was Travis Richam, the man whose life revolved around the next big romance arc. But Dr. Pallada... They understood each other. She was someone he felt he could trust, but... He let out a groan. Why did he have to revive this idiot again? So, when's the after-party? Richam asked. You'll have to arrange that yourself, Richam, Professor Bardsley replied bluntly, turning to leave. Then, with a smile, he added, Now, if you'll all excuse me, I have a class to teach. And with that, he headed off toward Pretty Boy College. It had been a few days since he'd been to class. Hopefully the students wouldn't have missed him too badly. Good morning, class, and welcome to Cultural Anthropology, came the dull, professional voice of Dr. Jensen, the replacement teacher for Professor Bardsley. Today's lesson will be on page 109 of your... Excuse me. The students gasped, muttering amongst themselves in shock. They all had heard the news. Their teacher, Leland Bardsley, had been outed as a member of the Chill of the Night. He had been killed on the spot by that Morty character. One of their classmates, Jonathan Mallory, had seen it himself. So how in the name of Liou was the man now standing in the doorway, perfectly alive? Dr. Jensen, for perhaps the first time in his entire career, looked genuinely surprised. Bardsley? What are you? I thought you were... I was. Professor Bardsley smiled politely, as he usually did, but this time it felt off. The students shifted nervously in their seats as their revived teacher strode confidently to the front of the classroom, stopping beside Dr. Jensen. If you don't mind, this is my class. I believe I should be teaching it. But Dr. Jensen swallowed hard. The school staff has already hired me as your replacement. I didn't think you'd be coming back. Well, to be fair, neither did I. Most don't usually recover from having their throat slit, but, well... Professor Bardsley chuckled lightheartedly. Why was he chuckling at that? At any rate, I already have a lesson prepared. It would be a shame to let it go to waste, wouldn't you agree? I have a lesson prepared too. Wouldn't you agree? Yes, of course, sir, Dr. Jensen stammered, stepping away from the lectern obediently. Whatever you want is fine, sir. The sir is a bit over the top, perhaps, but it will do, Professor Bardsley decided, pushing Dr. Jensen's notes aside and placing down his own. He looked over the crowd of students, all of them staring at him in dead silence. Usually some students would look bored or uninterested, but now he had the undivided attention of the class. He smiled to himself. He could get used to this. But soon his smile faded. Someone was missing. Has anyone seen Cassidy Jackson today? He asked the students. None of them dared answer aloud, just shaking their heads mutely. With a frown, Professor Bardsley turned to Dr. Jensen. Do you think you could go find Miss Jackson for me? It would be a shame for her to miss class. Yes, of course, Dr. Jensen answered meekly. I'll see if I can find her. Thank you, Professor Bardsley replied. That would be excellent. As Dr. Jensen hurried out of the room, Professor Bardsley calmly flipped open his lesson manual. Poor Cassidy must have been so tired after staying up all night, but he needed to keep an eye on her. It would be quite a shame to lose track of the creator of the revival potion, after all. Bardsley's words that morning stuck with Cassidy. She knew that Bardsley had taken the notes for the revival potion, and he'd made it clear that he didn't need her anymore. He was most likely going to kill her, and her grandpa, and probably Jonathan again, too. He would keep the potion to himself, and with it, the Mafia would be unstoppable. But Jonathan Mallory didn't like that plan. The ghost of Jonathan had kept himself hidden while Bardsley was present. He didn't want the professor to know that he was there, so hopefully he wouldn't see it coming. Bardsley locked away Cassidy's notes in his office just before they used the potion on him, so he had to act fast. The moments leading up to his death played through his mind over and over, so it wasn't hard for him to remember it. In fact, Bardsley himself proved it. Ghosts could carry solid objects, and that was exactly what Jonathan needed to do. As soon as Bardsley left his office, Jonathan's ghost sprang into action. He went straight for the notes, desperately trying to figure out how to pick them up. He knew it was possible, he just had to figure out how. After some effort, the papers lifted off the desk, floating in his ghostly hand. Yes! Jonathan desperately tried to carry the papers out of the room, dropping them and picking them up several times along the way. He was not used to this, but he didn't have the time to get used to it. All he needed to do was get those papers out of the room. He remembered how Bardsley had managed to take the papers straight through the door, but considering how hard it was for Jonathan to even carry them in the first place, he figured he didn't have the time to figure out how to do that. So he did the next best thing he could think of, which was carefully slide the notes under the door. He had barely managed to accomplish this when, a gasp for breath, he was snapped back into his body. He was alive, and Cassidy was sobbing over his body. Gasp, he whispered, his voice raspy. Coming back from the dead was hard on a person, it seemed. What time is it? I don't know. Early, she replied awkwardly. Why, what? As soon as school opens, we need to get to Bardsley's office, he told her. Your notes are under the door. We need to get there before anyone else finds them. What? But how? Jonathan smiled weakly. There are some perks to being dead. And so that was what they did. As soon as they could get inside the school, they made a beeline for Bardsley's office, where the notes still lay on the floor. They took them with them, and then they ran. They didn't know where they would go, but somehow, someway, they had to escape. It was their only hope. And, of course, with the collapse of society, it becomes easy for an outside force to rebuild it from the ground up as they see fit. Professor Bardsley looked up from his notes, smiling at the students. Any questions? At first, the class was silent. This was What kind of lesson was this? Had Professor Bardsley really just recited the events of the past week to them in the form of some kind of an objective study? He may have used ambiguous wording, but that sure sounded like what he was talking about. Surely he had to realize it. Was this on purpose? Was he trying to make them all suffer? He was a confirmed Mafia member. Finally, someone had the courage to raise their hand. Professor Bardsley turned to the student in question. Yes, Jordan? So, are we talking about Ipham Cove here, or what? Jordan asked. Professor Bardsley chuckled, apparently amused by the question. Good observation. Ipham Cove is a good example of this phenomenon, yes. I have to ask, Jordan continued, does this mean the Mafia is in charge now, or what? Ah, yes, I suppose you've all missed the announcement, Professor Bardsley realized. Yes, this town is under the rule of Winter's Wrath now. But don't worry, students. I assure you, you have nothing to fear. He gave another one of his eerily serene smiles. As long as you don't do anything rash, you'll be perfectly safe. No one dared respond to that. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, Professor Bardsley returned his attention to his notes. Now then, he said, shall we continue with the lesson? You're insane, Bardsley. Where the silence before was uncomfortable, the silence now was downright choking. The students began to panic. What was Jordan thinking saying that? How was Professor Bardsley going to respond? Would he kill Jordan? Would he kill someone else? Please don't use that word, Professor Bardsley eventually replied, his otherwise pleasant voice dripping with venom. The correct term for what I am is sociopathic. There's a difference, you know. Jordan considered replying, telling him that no, there really wasn't, but decided better of it. Arguing with the teacher, especially if that teacher was in the Mafia, was clearly not a good idea. It apparently was a sore topic as well, which Jordan didn't particularly want to dwell on why that was. Casually, as if nothing had happened, Professor Bardsley continued his lesson. However, in the back of his mind, he had to wonder, why hadn't Dr. Jensen returned with Cassidy yet? Where was Cassidy? And that is all. Class is dismissed. The students were all too eager to leave, scrambling out of their seats and out the door. Professor Bardsley moved next to the door so he could see them off, which only seemed to frighten them further. He chuckled to himself. Their fear was a little over the top, perhaps, but amusing. Standing by the door, though, Professor Bardsley was able to realize something. Dr. Jensen had been waiting outside the classroom, looking nervous. For how long was uncertain, but it was nonetheless concerning, especially considering that he was alone. Did you find Miss Jackson? Professor Bardsley asked, causing Dr. Jensen to jump. I'm sorry, sir, Professor, but I couldn't find her anywhere, Dr. Jensen stammered. Professor Bardsley frowned. Did you check the dorms? I even checked her dorm room, yes, Dr. Jensen confirmed. All her personal belongings were there, even her phone, but not her. A pause, and then a wry smile crossed Professor Bardsley's face. That's too bad, he spoke in a voice as smooth as silk. She must have left in a hurry due to some sort of family emergency. I'll have to check up on her later. What? Thank you for letting me know, Dr. Jensen. Professor Bardsley clapped a hand on his nervous colleague's shoulder. I'll be sure to look into it. And with that, the professor walked off, leaving Dr. Jensen and the students who overheard the conversation to stand there in confused, concerned silence. They found him around noontime, hiding like a wounded animal in the empty husk of the Ipham school, which was closed for winter break. His brother-in-law, Eyre, was gone. Went back home, grumbled a tired, hungry Morty when the mob finally spied him, sitting at a classroom desk. He looked exhausted. His always greasy hair was unkempt, his skin pale. Though his messenger bag full of weapons was within reach, he did not grab for anything. He simply stared at the encroaching crowd, dejected and defeated. They won, didn't they? He rasped. The mob didn't respond, but simply grabbed him. They marched him into the cold winter's afternoon and back to the town square, and gaped in awe at the new flag that flapped upon the flagpole. That blood-red background, harsh against the steely gray sky. Very impressive, crooned Professor Bardsley as Morty was dropped at the mafioso's feet. Morty fell to his knees, staring grimly at the professor, who'd come back to town after teaching his morning class. In fact, all the mafiosos who'd wandered off during the hunt had since reunited, all 7 of them standing in solidarity. How, Morty breathed as he looked at Bardsley, alive, vibrant, and leering. Are you... but you were... Dead? Finished Bardsley. Indeed I was. But now I am alive once again, as I should be. And soon you will be dead, as you should be. For what you did to Lindsay. For what you did to me. His tone was pure venom. He turned to glance at Nathan. The knife? He said silkily. Nathan pulled out the knife that he'd used to kill Dakota earlier. He'd since wiped away the mortician's blood, and its blade glinted beneath the pale winter sun. He offered it to Bardsley, and the professor accepted it as one might accept a baby, lovingly, sweetly. He stroked the handle and turned it over in his hand, as if to get a feel for it. Once he was satisfied, he looked down at Morty, grinning. Then he turned to address the crowd. "Let this serve as a lesson of what happens when you fight back," he cried. "Let his blood flow as payment for the blood that flowed from Lindsay's throat and from mine." As Bardsley talked, Travis Richam grabbed onto Morty's hair and used it as leverage to jerk back the man's head, exposing his neck for easier cutting. Travis was smiling from ear to ear and whispering to himself, though about what the crowd couldn't hear over the roar of Bardsley's voice. They could only watch, stomachs flipping, as Bardsley positioned himself in front of Morty and raised the knife. And then it was over. All the build-up, all the searching, all the anger ended in a single slash. Morty slumped over, dead. Bardsley, grinning even more broadly now, turned back to the crowd. He held the knife out towards them, revealing its wet, dripping blade. "Remember this blood," he said to them, "because for anyone who disobeys us, it shall be your blood staining this knife next. But if you cooperate—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The town square was silent, and so very, very cold.